Hi, this is Elijah Manor, and welcome to Mannerisms, where I talk about web development tips, tricks, and tools. In this video, we're going to talk about debouncing events when using the React library. You might think it's a trivial task, but there are some interesting things you need to keep in mind that may surprise you. So here on the right, we have a simple web page with a toggle button. If we click it, the input fields go away. If we click it again, they come back. And if we type in the input box, the text will immediately mirror in the text area below. So the purpose of this video is to debounce the events for toggling the button and for pressing keys for the text box. And what that means is that we want to prevent the actual event handler to be called until a certain time has transpired where the event has stopped happening. It's a bit easier to understand the concept by watching the behavior, so let's get started. Before we start writing some new code, I wanted to show you the code that we already have. So here we have a React widget component, and it essentially just has the input and text area that we see at the bottom of our web page. And then the app component itself has the button, the toggle button, and then also shows the widget conditionally. So if we click the toggle button, it'll come in here into the handler, grab the previous state, look at its show boolean off of the state, and flip it. So if it was false, it's now true. If it's true, it's now false. And then it'll re-render. And in here, we check that boolean show. If it's true, then we render the widget. If it's false, we do not render the widget. So in order to debounce our event, we first need to import debounce from Lodash. And then all we need to do for the simple case is to come down here and wrap our handle toggle with debounce. And then we'll give us some interval, and we'll say 1 second. So now we could come over here to our button, and we could click it a whole bunch of times, and you'll notice it's not actually doing anything yet. It's only when I stop triggering that event and then wait a second that it actually gets invoked. Likewise, if I click it a whole bunch again, it's not doing anything. It's only at the point when I stop, which is now, and it waits a second, and then it actually happens, which is pretty cool. Now let's go up to the widget component and debounce the onChange event on the input. If we were to follow what we did before, we would just say debounce here, and then we'd pass some interval. This time we'll just say half a second. Then we should just come in here and start typing some characters, and then once we pause for half a second, oh wait, we got an error, that's not good. But thankfully the error is pretty helpful. It's saying that this is a synthetic event, it's reused for performance reasons, and it's probably because we're trying to access the target or something else on it that is no longer available. So this is actually quite interesting. React does have official documentation about this synthetic event, which is essentially just a wrapper around the normal event, such that it could work cross-browser consistently. If we scroll down, we'll notice that the synthetic event is pooled and reused. And after the event callback has been invoked, it'll be nullified. So if you have any async code that references the event, it'll not work, unless you use the event.persist method that we'll look at a bit later. So let's go back to our code, and we'll get around this problem using two different techniques. The first technique, we're going to actually accept the text that we want to update and not the event itself. So we'll come in here and remove all this. And in our onChange, we'll accept the event here, which is filled out and has all the properties that we need. And we'll actually pass the value here. And so by the time it actually gets to the debounced event, it'll have the text, which should be fine. It's no longer the event that gets nulled out. So if we come in here and start typing and pause for half a second, it works. Before we go and try the other approach, I want to show a subtle bug that we now have in our code. In order to see it a little bit easier, we're going to remove the debounce from the toggle button. Then we're going to come up here, and what we're going to do is we're going to type something and then almost immediately click the toggle button. And we get a warning. What the warning is actually telling us is that we're calling setState on a component that's no longer mounted. Because if you recall, we typed some characters in the text box, which is debounced. It doesn't actually do its thing yet. But then we immediately toggled it to remove it from the screen, and then eventually that half a second occurred. It came into the set state and tried to change itself. But at that point, it's no longer mounted, so it's not needed, which is why we get this warning. Thankfully, the solution is pretty easy. We just come down here and put a component will and mount, and then we'll say this handle change. And thankfully, the debounce from Lodash gives us a cancel method, which will look and see if there's any outstanding events that need to be eventually triggered, and if there are, it'll just cancel them. So if we come back in here, type really quickly and press toggle, we'll no longer have the problem, because right before we unmounted the widget component, it canceled the debounce event. Now, let's look at a different way we could solve this problem. Let's go back to the code we had before, where we're passing in the event arg, and then we were accessing the target value off the event, and then we'll take off the 500. For now, we'll comment out the component1 unmount piece, and then we'll revert this part to what we had originally. So this piece of code works as it did earlier on, where it immediately mirrors every character. But again, we want to debounce this. So let's look at a different approach. So we're going to introduce a new method called debounce event. And we're going to capture all the arguments sent to us. And then we're going to call debounce, which is Lodash's debounce, and spread across the arguments that were passed to us. And then we'll save that in something called debounced event, so that we could hold on to it for later. And then we're going to return a function. And the first thing we're going to do in the event is to persist it. So that tells React, hey, I know you have this synthetic event, but I really want to use this later, so I want you to persist it. And at this point, we're going to return this debounced event, which we saved off from Lodash, and we'll pass in the persisted event to it. And so this actually creates a closure where we're saving off the debounced event, and then returning this other function that will be used inside the onChange. And so it'll get the event, we'll persist it, we'll pass it to the debounce event, and this has all the fancy logic of saying, like, don't do it immediately, do it later. So the last piece I have to do to wire this all up is say this debounce event, we tell it which event we want it to bounce, which is handle change, and then we give it a duration, like 500 milliseconds. So now if we type in here, it should work just fine. The last thing we need to do is there's that other bug that we talked about. And since we're saving off debounce from Lodash as debounced event, we could just come in here and say this.debouncedEvent.cancel. So now we should be able to type real quick, toggle, and we don't have an error. Thanks for watching the Mannerisms channel. I hope you found some value from this video. I've left some links in the video description if you'd like to read up on some of the topics I've mentioned. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and feel free to subscribe to the channel for additional web development videos. Until the next video, you can find me on Twitter at ElijahManner. Until then, have a blessed day.